Hi folks, welcome to today's color process video. Right, so here we have yet another comic that I did with the aid of my Lightbox. And as I said in the typed up process post, as handy as the Lightbox is for doing comics like this with the various repeating elements without me having to resort to digitally copy pasting, I do worry that I may become too reliant on it. So I'm hoping with next week's comics that I'll go back to not relying so much, if at all, on the Lightbox. Like have more variation in the actual line work. Now, I mean the reason I used the Lightbox was because this comic and the other comics called for repeating elements. It just so happens they have all been this week. Like my art tends to go that way, where even if I don't intend on it, where I'll focus on like one particular like tool or style of doing something, and you'll see that throughout like a few comics, and then I'll move on to some other thing in subsequent comics. Like if you look back over my older work, you'll often see like phases in my work where like I'll be very much focused on one thing and then I'll move on to some other thing after that. So because of the repeating nature of the background in this, I went with I went with a fairly well, not a fairly. I did go with a consistent color scheme. Like I was going to have a bit more variation with the background colors, like maybe having the walls. Let me check here. Like I can actually look back here on my timeline. But I was thinking of having the walls be very briefly. I was thinking of going for kind of like a cream color to the walls, and with the checkerboard pattern on the floor, I was thinking of very briefly of going for kind of a red color with that. However, the main reason I didn't go for that color for the floor was because, simply speaking, the hot dog would have gotten lost in those colors, like it would have blended in too much. So the floor being that blue color is not just an aesthetic choice. It's also there because I needed that hot dog to stand out. And yeah, I mean, that's for me, often color choices come down to that, like what will make certain elements stand out more. And sometimes I have to go with colors that I didn't originally intend, but you just end up going with what makes the piece more readable. And it's also why the color of the cat changed. Like originally, like the cat was going to be. Oh, pardon me, excuse me. Oh my, excuse me. Sorry, that yawn came from nowhere. Well, it came from my mouth, obviously. Anyways, but the cat was originally going to be kind of a charcoal, kind of grey color. But again, because of the very desaturated blues, almost verging on grey colors that I went for with the background, the cat would have just, again, would have just like gotten lost in all of that. So I needed to go with a color that would contrast better against all that blue. So I went with more kind of like a chocolate brown kind of color to the cat. And yeah, that I mean that did the trick where the cat very much stands out as a result. The final panel with the shading, that was a lot of fun to work on, because typically with the when I do that style of shading, I'll I've explained it before, but I'll have like a separate layer on top of whatever requires shading. I will set that to multiply. Then I'll command select or command or control select the subject I wanted to add shade. I want to add shading to. That'll create obviously a selection of that panel, that layer. Then I will select the shading layer and I will fill in with the color I require. Of course, here I go for kind of like a purpley kind of shading effect. And typically the way I will get across the lighting is I will use the lasso tool to cut out the areas that I want to be lit. However, here, let me again check on my timeline here precisely how I did it. I actually have to go back quite a bit for this. So yeah, the way I went about it was I cut out a fairly big area, which left a lot of the face blank, and very different to my usual process. I actually went and started painting in the shading by hand, and I did it very roughly to begin with, just to get the lay of the land, so to speak, with regards to the lighting, like how I wanted it to look. And then from there, I just touched it up and just further enhanced it and made it more solid. And it's a slower process, I find, shading that way, but it feels nice as well. Like my typical way of shading, it almost feels like chipping away at some stone and finding the piece underneath. Whereas shading, where like you're actually adding the color on, like the shading on by hand, um, it feels more like creating something from clay and then adding more clay to that rather than chipping away at it. And if you've ever modeled something using clay, you know it's very satisfying. There's a tactile quality to it, and it almost feels like that when you do your shading like by hand, so to speak, rather than just like cutting chunks away. It feels more natural to do it that way. And I mean, the only reason I don't do a lot of my shading that way is, to be frank, it takes much more time, and I tend to go with what will save me time on my pieces, because as much as I would like to spend time getting everything perfect, sometimes you've just got to go with just good enough, and this is one of those cases. Or rather, this was one of those cases where I went I went the opposite, with the opposite tack. But then if you look at the shading for the cat in the other panels, the way I've gone about it there, yeah, I've gone about my typical process there, where I just cut away the areas I want lit. Going back to the background colors here, another thing I did, which is different to how I usually do things, and kind of inspired by the previous comic with the caveman, is I used a lot of gradients to get across a sense of depth in the background elements. Like on the floor, you can see there, or at least I hope you can see it in the video right now. But yeah, with the floor, I added just like a touch of gradient to it, where it starts off darker at the top and then gradually lightens as it comes down. It's a very quick way of adding a sense of depth without having to put a lot of time into it. Again, as I was mentioning about shading, it's a time-saving exercise. And typically with my comics, I wouldn't go about rendering things that way, at least with how I color currently. But I think I might start doing this a bit more, because it really does save time. And not to sound like a broken record, but I've got to focus on things that will save me time, because you know as an artist, you do want things to look perfect, but at the same time, you don't want to be spending your entire day doing something. So you will use shortcuts to better speed your process up. And I like I find one of the things you learn as an artist is finding a style for yourself is partly about finding shortcuts like that. Like knowing when not to draw a line, or when not to color something, can be just as important as the opposite. And yeah, little things like that in the color process, like using tools like gradients, and yeah, they can just really help with speeding things up and make it so that I can still create something that looks good, but it doesn't take me near as much time to make it look good. So yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be using gradients constantly in my work from now on, but it's certainly something I will look into using if I have to for future work. So yeah, I will leave it at that, and I hope you have a good weekend, and I will talk to you at the next video. Take care.